The first play we're going to study is the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. And you can see the date is 1594. So Shakespeare, when this play was published and first performed, was 30 years old. This is a copy of the first, one of the first editions of the play, an excellent conceited tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, as it hath been often, with great applause, played publicly by the Right Honourable the Lord of Hunsdon's his servants. So you can see that this was printed, it looks like in 1597, and that it has been performed for a while, and that Shakespeare was under the patronage at this point of Lord Hunsdon, and his acting company is referred to as his servants. Give you a little bit of background about questions that I've found helpful in reading any literature, so that those of you who are going to be teachers might keep these in mind for future reference. Often when we read a work of literature, we think of it as something that is always this way. It always had to be this way. No other way could it have ever been, because that's what we know. But we have to always remind ourselves that the writer is always making choices as he or she is writing. And these three simple questions, what, why, and so what, I find helpful questions to get us to think about what choices a writer has made. So we might look at really any aspect of any piece of literature, a word, a chapter in a novel, the title of a novel. In our case, we're going to be looking at plays, and here Romeo and Juliet. Well, the movie Shakespeare in Love fools around with this idea in calling the potential play Romeo and Ethel, the Pirate's Daughter. What if the play had that title, and what if Ethel, not Juliet, was Romeo's love object, and what if she was a pirate's daughter? You can see how that play would have gone off in a different direction. So what choices have been made here? Why those choices and not others? And then finally, what difference to our reading does it make to have noticed that? So that's the so what question. So what that Shakespeare decided to call Juliet Juliet and not Ethel? So what that the play begins with a prologue that basically tells the whole story, tells the background? What if he had chosen not to begin the play with a prologue? So those are three helpful questions that I think you can use during this course and when you're reading any other literature or teaching literature. In the previous PowerPoints, we talked about competing public theaters, competing public acting companies. And as a reminder, Burbage with the Curtain, and then the Globe Theatre, and his actors, his company was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and Shakespeare will later become part owner of this company. And that's what we're seeing going on as sort of a backstory in Shakespeare in Love. Shakespeare getting enough money together, the 50 pounds, to become part owner of that of Burbage's company. And the competition at the Rose Theatre under Philip Henslowe, and his company was called the Admiral's Men. The next slide is Shakespeare's acting company. We talked about this a little bit in a previous PowerPoint, that Queen Elizabeth had ordered that actors had to be licensed. And so they couldn't just be wandering vagrants. They had to be part of a group under a noble patron. Shakespeare's company was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then when Queen Elizabeth died, King James became the king, and Shakespeare's company became known as the King's Men, so he was being sponsored by the king himself. Shakespeare was one of 10 owners of the company, so he received 1/10 of the proceeds from the tickets, what we would call tickets that were sold, from the admissions that were sold. Um, if they did any touring, he would get 10%. Richard Burbage was the principal owner and was their star actor. And they built and owned the Globe Theater, so if the Globe was used by any other company, they would also receive rent or payment from the other companies. Will was their principal playwright for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and so between 1594 and 1603 they performed at the Globe and at a theater that was called, imaginatively, the Theater, and also at court. Slide. This is a nice diagram that I copied from a book by a father and son team, David Crystal and Ben Crystal, Shakespeare's Words. And they have visual diagrams of each play. So just going over this a little bit, you can see that up at the very top, the chorus begins and ends the play, so forms kind of a parenthesis around the play. There are two houses, the house of Montague and the house of Capulet. And Romeo is of the house of Montague. His servants start the play. He has a good friend named Benvolio. Over on the right side is Juliet's family, the Capulet family, Lady Capulet and the father. The nephew, Tybalt, and Samson and Gregory are the servants who begin the play with the fight against Romeo's serving men. The nurse is the nurse in this household, and one way that you can remember and help your students when you're a teacher remember the two houses. Romeo ends with an O, and the family he's from ends in a vowel like Romeo, and easier to do it the other way. The Capulet family, all their names end in T's. Lady Capulet, Lady Capulet, Juliet, Tybalt. The friar is the other principal focus of the play, and up at the top, Mercutio is an important character, friend of Romeo, and adversary of Tybalt. So I hope this helps you to picture what's going on the stage. Is the fact that few plays that he wrote begin with a prologue. This play does. So what does this prologue do? Well, I said right off that the prologue tells the plot. The plot was a reminder. This was not an unknown story. As I'll talk in a few minutes, the play was based on a popular, what we would call novel of the time, that was based on works that were derived from French and Italian literature. You could ask, how essential is it if you were going to one question I like to ask is, if you were going to do a movie and you haven't seen a movie of a play, what would you leave in? Most movies have to cut out a tremendous number of lines and leave only essential lines in the movie, because movies can't be weighted down by a lot of words. They're basically a visual medium. So would you leave this prologue in your movie? Is it essential? Could you skip the prologue and begin with Act 1, Scene 1? Take a look at the play when you start reading it and just cover up the prologue and see if you would be okay starting with the servants entering. Go through the prologue and take a look at any of the key words you might find in it. It's interesting when we watch the second movie with regard to this of Romeo and Juliet, the way Baz Luhrmann interprets the prologue is by doing it as a news story on television and talking about the newscaster is announcing the problems between the families. A famous phrase in the prologue is the phrase on line 6, star-crossed lovers. And so this gives away, right away, the fact that this play, unlike other tragedies, is not based so much on internal character flaws of the principal actors. Here, it's as if the love is doomed even before it starts. We have acts and scenes. Notice that if you look at Act 1, Scene 1, notice that it's in brackets. Anything that's in a bracket is something that later editors have added to the play. So this indicates that when the play was first printed, it did not have the designation Act 1, Scene 1. There were few scene breaks stipulated. A scene essentially changes when there's a break in the action, when there's a major change of personnel on the stage. There were no curtains, so there would be nothing like curtain going up or curtain coming down. It's all indicated by the motion on the stage. So if you look at the first scene, you can see the number of parts that the first scene has. Samson and Gregory, and then 2 other serving men enter, so 4 people so far. And these are all low-class people with a lot of sort of foul-mouthed allusions in what they're talking about. When they talk on line 43 or so, do you bite your thumb at us? That would be the equivalent of giving someone the finger in Elizabethan England. And so that's something you can fool around with, and you'll often hear on Comedy Central or something, South Park. Sometimes you'll hear a line like, "Do I bite my thumb at you?" And it's just an allusion to the fact that everybody on the writing staff of these comedy shows have studied and read Shakespeare quite extensively. Benvolio comes on, and he's an upper class member, and so the fighting spreads from the lower class people to the young upper class people. And so you have Benvolio, who's a friend of Romeo, and Tybalt, who's Juliet's cousin, a hothead, and they get into a to-do. And then more citizens come on, indicating that this is a widespread animosity between the families. And then the third group of people come on. These are the old people, the parents. And so old Capulet comes on, and he is as hot-headed as the young people. So you can see how the fight has spread from lower class to upper class, from young to old. It goes throughout the whole society. The prince enters, and he, like Queen Elizabeth, had tried to eliminate dueling. Dueling was a popular way of settling scores in Elizabethan England, as it is, although we call them riots or gang fights now. She tried to eliminate dueling, and that's what the prince is doing here, and he is prohibiting it. Let us look then at the next. Romeo finally comes on well into this play at line 171, and if you listen to how Romeo speaks, you can see that he speaks in a very stylized and old-fashioned way of talking. Part of that is due to the fact that this is one of Shakespeare's early plays, and part of it is due to the fact that Shakespeare is establishing Romeo as having an artificial and stylized love at this point. He comes on and begins with, "Alas, that love, whose view is muffled still, should without eyes see pathways to his will. Where shall we dine? Oh, for me, what fray was here? And so he has entered the stage and sees lying on the stage swords, clubs, pieces of clothing. And so there's sort of an interruption in his tone of voice. Oh me, what fray was here? Yet tell me not, for I have heard it all. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first create, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep, that is not what it is. This love I feel that feel no love in this. Dost thou not laugh? Okay, so you can see what an artificial way of speaking. It was hard to even read some of these lines without a struggle. You can see that his principle, he's speaking in a very poetic style here, an artificial poetic in the bad sense style. Feather of lead, bright smoke. These are all opposites. Technically, they're called oxymorons. Cold fire. So opposites put together. And so Romeo here is talking as if he is a very self-conscious young poet. On the slide, I refer you to turning towards a later passage from Romeo, and you'll see that there's a different style of speaking. The style of speaking later on becomes much more natural, much more internalized. Here it's a very external style. If you look just at the punctuation of the passage in Act 1, Scene 1, line 171, notice at the end of every line, pretty much, there is a punctuation mark. Whenever there's a punctuation mark, it forces the person to stop or slow down. And if it's a terminal punctuation mark, a question mark, or a period, it means that the thought is complete. Notice how many lines the thought is entirely complete on each line. You'll see as Shakespeare grows as a writer, he will stop doing that. Thoughts will go over several lines, and so you do not stop when there is no punctuation at the end of the line. You might slow down very slightly if you turn to line 188. I'll give you an example of that. Or line 186, let's say. Why, such is love's transgression. And there's a full stop there. Now, watch what happens in the next couple of lines. Griefs of mine own lie heavy in my breast, which thou wilt propagate, to have it pressed with more of thine. So do you notice how there is no period or comma after the word pressed, so you continue with only the slightest hesitation on to the next line. Okay, now let's turn to the next. So as I said, he was probably in his late 20s when he wrote the play, performed probably around 1594, first published in 1597. And the play is based on several sources that we're now going to look at. And here's the principal way in which the play diverges from the movie Shakespeare in Love. The movie indicates that Shakespeare is writing the entire play based on his personal love experience with Viola. In fact, the play is based on a poem called Romeo and Juliet, and that itself is based on the myth from Greek and Roman times of Pyramus and Thisbe. And so we'll go into that a little bit now in the next couple of slides. There was a play. Let's go to the next slide. One of the principal points of Brooks' poem, Romeo and Juliet, is that it has a moral. It's written as a moral to young people. And specifically, it warns against becoming enthralled to unhonest desire, neglecting authority, and advice of friends. So it's trying to teach the readers what not to do and what to do when you fall in love. And so it tells the story of Romeo and Juliet, Romeus and Juliet, and warns against falling in love in secret, the way Romeo and Juliet do, not listening to your parents' advice, and good advice from friends. So it's a highly moralistic poem. And the big question then is, does Shakespeare write his play to provide a moral or advice to the viewers and the readers? So when you finish the play, do you say to yourself morally, I'm glad I would never fall in love like that. I would definitely listen to my parents despite my feelings. Is that the moral of the play itself? Or do you finish the play saying, what a beautiful love story? And although, of course, few of us are going to finish reading the play or viewing the play and go out and commit suicide, we understand that the suicide in the play is a part of literature and not an actual advice on how to conduct yourself. So is the play, like the story, a moralistic advice, like going to a counselor? Next slide. A number of changes that Shakespeare made from Brooke we need to think about. The poem by Brooke takes place over 9 months. Very significantly, the play takes place in just 2 or 3 days. So Shakespeare intentionally changes the pacing and time frame of his play from what he read, and doesn't even put it down to 1 month or a couple weeks, but 2 or 3 days, almost the shortest amount of time possible. In the poem, Juliet is around 16 or 18 years old. In the play, he has specifically reduced her to age 13. So again, we should be asking the questions, what did he do? Why did he do it? And so what? What's the meaning of the change? 2 principal characters that Shakespeare added that were not at all in Brooke are Mercutio and the nurse. And these are major characters in Shakespeare's play, in that they have some of the best lines in the entire play. Mercutio, foul-mouthed and dirty, and the nurse also foul-mouthed and dirty in a different way. So why did Shakespeare add these 2 characters? They weren't in his sources. What do they add to his play? Why does he put them in the play? What purpose do they serve? And then the final major change I want to note is that Brooke's poem is moralistic. Don't disobey parents. Don't listen to Catholic priests, written by a Protestant. So the poem portrays the Catholic priest, the friar, in very negative terms, and specifically says, don't listen to these Catholic priests. And then again, what I said before, don't thrall yourself to unhonest desire. Obviously, Shakespeare has a much more complicated and complex tone than the simple moralisms of Arthur Brooke. Let's go on to the next. The play is also based on the myth of Pyramus and Thisbe, and this was a myth that Shakespeare, as a young boy in school, would have read and studied and maybe even acted out from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Some background on the myth. Pyramus, the boy, and Thisbe, the girl, are neighbors in ancient Babylon, and their homes were separated by a large brick wall. And they could not marry because of a disagreement between their fathers, and so they talked to each other through a hole in the wall. They decided one night to meet at a tomb, Ninus's tomb, in the woods outside Babylon. And while Thisbe waited for her lover to come, a lioness came to the nearby stream and frightened Thisbe away. When she fled, she dropped her shawl, and the lioness ripped it with her bloody jaws, and then left the stream and left the shawl behind. Pyramus came to the tomb and found his love's ripped, bloody shawl, and assumed that she'd been killed by a lion. He killed himself with his sword to be with his love. Thisbe soon returns and finds Pyramus slain there, and so she kills herself as well. Their blood changed the color of the mulberry tree under which they lay. The berries changed from white to burgundy from the lover's blood. And so that's the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, and you can see that there are similarities between that myth and Shakespeare's play. At the very same time that Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet, he was writing the play that we're going to be reading in 2 weeks, Midsummer Night's Dream. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, this story of Pyramus and Thisbe is acted out. So we know that he was thinking about this myth during this year when he's writing these 2 plays that are both very similar to each other. One a tragedy, and Midsummer Night's Dream a comedy, both with the same story, same underlying story upon which they're based. So that will lead us to ask questions in a couple weeks about the fact that he is taking one story and writing a tragedy one day and a comedy the next day. Okay, so that'll be it for the introduction to this play. Go ahead and read the play now. Let me know if you have any questions on it, if you're stuck with certain passages, and choose one of the questions that I've posted on the play to do a significant starter discussion posting, and then come back several times and comment on other people's points that they have made about your posting, or make comments on other people's main postings.